You ever notice that people always seem to be striving after something? The overwhelming majority of the people in this world, with relatively few exceptions, spend their lives going after something, or even going after several things. For many people, we see this in our work. We see this in our jobs. From the time you're little, people ask you, what do you want to do when you grow up? What do you want to be when you grow up? And then you go through the grind that is the school system, right? For 12 plus years, you're being trained. And then this past year, I worked as a guidance counselor. And I'm sitting with these juniors and seniors, asking them, what do you want to do next? And I see the anxiety in their faces as they're saying, I don't know what I want to do, but there's so much pressure striving towards that next thing. And so they go to college or they do the next thing. And if they go to college, they change their major 3 to 5 times and they finally get in their career. And some of you guys know this, that feeling. You're like, I'm in my career. I have arrived. Only to find out that you got to keep striving. Because it's not just good enough to get in your career. You got to keep working up the ladder, right? You got to keep climbing the ladder. Go after the next thing. In fact, one of the things I've learned about the trends over the past 30 plus years, 30 years ago, if you stayed with a company and you were loyal and you stayed in that position, it was deemed an honorable thing. Nowadays, if you stay in your position in your company for more than a few years, people wonder what's wrong with you. Because you need to keep striving for the next thing. We make great sacrifices. We pursue many things for the sake of a career, always going after what's next. Now, perhaps that doesn't really describe your heart. Perhaps for you, you're like, listen, I don't really care what the job is. I care about what the job brings, okay? Because I know that through my work, it's going to give me the money that will provide for me the opportunities to do the things that I have been looking forward to doing. I once heard a man say that money is nothing more than opportunity. That's what money is at its root. And so for you, you're like, listen, I don't need to be a billionaire. I just want to have the freedom to travel. I just want to have enough money that I can retire when I want to. And so you strive to earn, to bring in those possessions, always going after the next thing. Perhaps for you, it's neither of those two things. Perhaps for you, it's relationships. But there are many people that are like, listen, I want to be loved. I want to be liked. I want people to respect me. And so for you, in every social situation, you feel this incredible anxiety because you want so desperately to be liked. You want to be respected. You want people to know you. You want people to look up to you. Or perhaps for you, it's a lot simpler than all of these things. Maybe you're not spending your life going after those things. Maybe you're spending your life going after pleasure. Maybe it's that next hit, that next joy. Maybe you're not doing drugs or anything like that, but maybe for you it's the next adventure. It's that excitement. You're waiting for that next exciting thing to happen. And so you're always thinking, what's next? What new adventure can I go on? Maybe for you it's the pleasure that comes from substance. You know, it says in Philippians that for some people, their God is their stomach. And what that means is you're living for that next thing you can take in to give you incredible joy. Whether it be food, whether it be alcohol, whether it be drugs, whether it be sexual encounters, for many people, they are living after that next hit, that next high, that next experience. And yet in the midst of all of this, we find that a good portion of the people out there find themselves consistently dissatisfied. People are going after, striving so hard, and yet they're filled with despair, with discouragement, finding themselves always wondering what's next. You know, the Bible has a thing or two to say about that. And today we're going to look at the book of Ecclesiastes chapter 2. And what we're going to see in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, the author of Ecclesiastes is searching for meaning. And so with that in mind, the title for today's sermon is The Search for Meaning. Now before we dig into the text, let's take a moment and pray. Father, I love your word, and I love that you speak to our hearts. God, I know how much this passage has impacted my life, and I pray that you would bless all who would hear this with that same blessing, Lord, that we would begin to look at our lives in the way that you encourage us to do it. Lord, that I pray that perhaps today people would be set free from the slavery to the next thing that they're looking for. Lord, that you would give us your perspective. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. If you haven't done so already, please open your Bibles to Ecclesiastes chapter 2. We're going to be looking at the entire chapter. Just to give you a little bit of background for this book, nobody knows who the author of this book is, but many scholars believe that it's at least inspired by the life and the story of King Solomon. King Solomon was in many ways the greatest king of Israel. He was the one that brought Israel to its greatest prosperity. He had so much money that it says, in fact, that during his days, silver was as plentiful as stones. And this King Solomon decides to do a scientific experiment. In chapter 2, we see this scientific experiment. If you know anything about science, you begin with a hypothesis, and then you develop an experiment to test that hypothesis. And in chapter 2, what we've seen is that this man called the preacher has observed that people are spending their lives going after these things. And so he decides to see if any of the things that people go after, do they actually last? Are they meaningful? So he enacts a test. He decides to test out those things and to see what results he might find. We're going to begin in verse 1. We're going to cover the whole chapter today, but for now, we're just going to read verses 1 through 11. I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also, my wisdom remained with me. And whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil that I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity and striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. Our first lesson, put this in your notes, you won't find lasting meaning in pleasure. You won't find lasting meaning in pleasure. He begins by saying, I will test you with pleasure. And over these 11 verses, he looks at the various places that people get pleasure. Now, it's at this point that there's a key word that I want you to pay attention to, because this word shows up over and over again in the book of Ecclesiastes. Some of your translations use the word vanity. Other translations use the word meaningless. At the root of this word, at its most base meaning, the word for vanity or meaningless literally means vapor. It is there like a vapor. If you think about vapors, you can feel a vapor, you can see it for a moment, you can feel the effects, but then it is gone almost as fast as it is there. And the conclusion that the preacher comes up with in Ecclesiastes is that these things that so many people spend their lives going after, they are but a vapor. You get the moment, and then it is gone. And so he decides to test pleasure. Well, what does he test? Well, I'm going to say he begins by testing what I'm going to call pleasure proper. This is just straight up the indulgence of the flesh. Notice what it says in verse 3. I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine. Now notice he's not getting blackout drunk. In fact, he says, my heart was still guiding me with wisdom. This is a very particular test. This is an experiment. He notices that people drink alcohol because it makes them feel good. So he says, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to see what happens. So I'm going to take in this wine, I'm going to let it feel good for a moment, and I'm going to see what happens by it. And his conclusion at the end was, it is vanity. It is a vapor. It is there for a moment, and then it is gone. That's what we see from him. It is there for a moment, and then it is gone. Now later on, we learn that he goes beyond this. He goes beyond the wine, and he says, I took in whatever I could to see. He says, I withheld nothing that my eyes desired. He saw something that looked good, he ate it. He saw something that looked good, he drank it. He saw something that felt good, he did it. He pursued pleasure. And he said, let's see if this is meaningful. Let's see if this lasts. And his conclusion, it is but a vapor. Well, why does this work? In fact, do you know that they have actually done scientific studies to back up what the preacher is saying here? Do you know that they can actually test pleasure in a person? Now, bear with me for a moment. I'm going to get a little scientific, okay? I'm going to get a little scientific because this actually fits with what we're covering at. It turns out that the pleasure you feel can actually be monitored by the dopamine levels in your body. That when you take in a stimulus, your brain sends out dopamine, tells your body to send out dopamine, and that dopamine is what gives you your euphoria, your pleasure. And they can actually monitor the dopamine levels in people. It's a pretty fascinating thing. And they've done studies on dopamine and the effects of dopamine on the body. Now I want to show you a chart that's up here, because this chart actually is based on the effect of hardcore drugs on a person. And I'm going to suggest to you that even though this is an extreme, that the principles that apply to this apply to all forms of pleasure. So let's begin with this. If you see in the chart, you have what begins with is the normal dopamine levels in a human being. This is your baseline pleasure. When a person takes in that hardcore drug like heroin or cocaine, you see a massive spike in dopamine levels. You see that first high. That's the euphoria. That's why people do it, right? They do it for the high. You would expect, however, that once they come down from that high, that they would go back to the baseline level of dopamine. But that's not what happens. What they've discovered is, instead of going back and stopping at that baseline, you see that your dopamine levels actually regulate lower than where you started, so that your new baseline of pleasure is less than what it originally was. Now, you'll see another spike here, and that's the next time you take in that drug. And you will say, sure, you will get another peak, but you'll notice that next peak is not that much higher than your baseline pleasure. And you see that it kind of stays there in the middle. This is called tolerance. God designed our body that we would build up tolerance to the substances that we take in. And so you don't get the same result the more you do the same thing. We see that this happens. And then it gets worse, because you start to see after those hits that you're getting that the line keeps going down, and before you know it, you have to take that drug just to survive, let alone thrive. That the pleasure you once received, you can never recapture again. You become dependent, addicted to that substance. Now, you can see this more readily with the extreme drugs, but it applies to all forms of pleasure. We find that whether it's a food that you like, the first time you take it in, you get so excited, you get high. And by the way, they've also done a study, and they find out that you receive the greatest dopamine release before you even eat your food. It's when you're going through the drive-through, that anticipation. So if you want to go on a diet, just drive through some drive-thrus and don't get any food. No, that doesn't work that way. Your body will figure out you're lying. But you're going after that food, right? And you get that high. And guess what? The more you do it, it's called the Law of Diminishing Returns. I have a sad story from my personal life where this happened. When I was a kid, I fell in love with an item in Dairy Queen. It was called the Banana Pudding Blizzard. Now, this is on the secret menu, so you guys all now know the secret, okay? And when I was a kid, my brother introduced me to this, and I had my first Banana Pudding Blizzard, and my eyes lit up. I'm sure I probably had dilated eyes or whatever. This was so good. And for some reason, my parents wouldn't bring me to Dairy Queen every single day. I mean, come on. And so about once or twice a year, I got to enjoy my Banana Pudding Blizzard until my junior high years. You see, I had two things my junior high that was a dangerous combination. I had money and I had a bicycle. And I'll tell you, that summer, I rode my bike to Dairy Queen every single day. And I got that Banana Pudding Blizzard every single day. And you know what's really sad, though, is it stopped giving me the same pleasure. Now, they had the same chemicals. It was made the same way all throughout. But by the end of the summer, I actually got kind of sick of it. It wasn't as enjoyable. It made me sad. That's what happens with pleasure. It has a law of diminishing returns. The gain from pleasure will not last. The author of Ecclesiastes comes to that conclusion as well. We also see that the gain from accomplishments won't last. Follow along with me again in verses 4 through 6. He says, I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. You see, the second thing that the author, the preacher, decides to test out is accomplishments. He pours himself into his work. He builds these great things. Now, you might not think it's a big deal to plant trees and make pools and things like that. I'll tell you, first of all, as somebody who's tried planting things, it is a big deal if it stays alive for more than 10 seconds. So it is a big deal. It's a lot of hard work, but it's an even bigger deal in Israel. Because in Israel, trees did not grow naturally in Israel back in those days. Trees did not grow. In fact, they have old pictures where you could just see it looks like a desert. It looks brown. It's not green. So for him to be able to plant trees that yielded fruits, for him to be able to make pools so that there was a constant supply of water, this is a big deal. He invested himself into these projects. And you know what conclusion he came up with? Vanity, vapor. The joy was there for a moment and then it was gone. Now, this might be hitting some of you where you're at, because some of you in this room, some of you who are listening, are very high achievers. You love going after the next thing, doing the next thing. You love the accolades. You love putting those letters after your name or before your name. I don't know where you put it anymore. But you love being able to accomplish those things. And so you look at that and you're like, look what I did. But here's the thing about accomplishments. You get two pleasures from accomplishments. You get the pleasure of the work when you're working towards it, the excitement. Now, for some of you, this is why you're really good at starting projects, but you're not really good at finishing projects. Because the pleasure of the beginning of the project is good, and then that goes away, and then you got to go through the grind of the project. But others of you have that grit, and you push through, and you get it done, and then you get the pleasure of a job well done. And you look back, and you're like, that is beautiful, that is great. And then you wonder what's next. See, the problem with that pleasure is it's fleeting. It doesn't last. A couple years ago, I had the privilege of getting together with a bunch of my old high school youth group friends. We actually did a high school youth group 20-year reunion because our old youth pastor was in town. And I remember sitting around the table, and he's asking, how are you guys doing? We hadn't seen him in like 20 years. And I noticed as I was listening to the answers of my friends that every single one of us was going through a midlife crisis, but for two very opposite reasons. For some of my friends, they were looking back and reflecting on their high school self, and they saw where their life had gone, and they realized they would never achieve the dreams that they had when they were in high school. That they did not become the person that they thought they would be. Life hit them hard, They had to settle for something else, and they were depressed because they had not met the goals that they thought they would achieve. Surprisingly, the opposite also happened. That amongst others of my friends, they had achieved their goals, they had worked their tail off, they were doing extremely well in their field, and yet they were wondering what's next. They didn't know what was next. They got to the end, and they were left saying, what can I strive after now? Both sides came to the same conclusion, that it doesn't satisfy. So let me tell you, if you're a person who finds your joy and pleasure in your accomplishments, and if that is what is driving you at the core, prepare to be dissatisfied. It doesn't last. I think about this with the kids' camp. The kids' camp, God did such great work. And you see so many things that are going on. And all of you who put in that time and effort, you did amazing things. And I do believe God is going to use it. And right now you're in that high of looking back and saying, well done. But I got to tell you, in a week or two, you're going to be like, okay, what's next? That's how life works. So the gain from accomplishments won't last. The gain from pleasure won't last. The gain from possessions won't last. Look at verses 7 and 8. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. We see the next thing that the preacher tests out is he tests out possessions. He gets as much money as you can imagine. In fact, if this is in fact Solomon, they have found out he brought in approximately $35 million a year from tax revenue alone, not including the money he brought in from trade, which is probably 10 times that. You think about these sports figures and the amount of money they're making, Solomon brought in more. In fact, it says he had so much money, they treated silver like stones. He bought whatever he wanted. He saw it, he bought it, and so he kept buying and buying and buying, and he came to the conclusion that all the stuff that he bought only provided temporary pleasure. It didn't last. And if you want to see this principle in action, just look at a child when you give them a toy. Right? You buy them a toy, and for them, it's the greatest thing in the world. Until about 2 weeks later, they get the next thing, and all of a sudden, that's all they want. Or you buy them a toy and they care more about the bag than they do the toy itself. That's the other thing I find interesting. But we get these things. Some people believe, and there may be some of you that believe this, that if only you can get more, if only you got that next pay raise, if only you got that next job, if only you could get that bigger house, if only. There's one man who said, "He who dies with the most toys wins." I think that's stupid. He who dies with the most toy may look like Pharaoh's corpse. You're still a corpse with just a lot of rich things around you. You can't take your toys with you. Jesus says this. He says, do not store up for yourself treasures on earth where moth and rust can destroy and where thieves can break in and steal. Store up your treasures in heaven. Because the thing about money and possessions, they don't last. They don't last forever. And even if they last, the joy from them do not last forever. The final thing that he tests out in this early portion of Ecclesiastes 2 is fame. You'll notice in verse 9, he says, "So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me." You see, what happened was he was well respected. He was so respected that people came from all over the place to pursue him. He wanted fame. He was pursuing fame and popularity. He was well liked. I think of Willie Loman from the story Death of a Salesman. The salesman who his purpose in life was to be well liked. He did everything because he wanted to be liked. And there might be some of you are driven by relationship. You want everyone to love you. You want everyone to like you. And you are striving and striving and striving for that. And yet the problem with popularity, the problem with fame, is that you can be on the top one moment and you can be on the bottom the next. I want to show this picture here. I found this one. I thought this one was very relevant right now. Because you may notice it's Will and his wife, Jada Pinkett Smith. Will Smith is extraordinarily famous. He's made many blockbuster movies. He's a musician, well-respected, well-known, and this past year it all came crashing down with one slap. Because during the Oscars, he slapped Chris Rock because Chris Rock insulted his wife, and then Will Smith got banned from the Academy. You're not likely to see too many more Will Smith movies in the years to come. Here he was at the peak of popularity, and in a moment it is gone. That's the problem with popularity and fame. That's the problem with being the story. The story doesn't last for long. I tell this to my junior hires when I teach them. They come in and they do something embarrassing, you know. They're talking in class and their voice cracks and all the other kids laugh at them, you know. And I remember I'll talk to these students. I'm like, listen, in a week, nobody's going to remember this. In a week, someone else is going to do something stupid and they're going to talk about them. That's how life works. And yet people are obsessed with fame. Social media is a cesspool for people who are longing for their 15 minutes of fame. TikTok exists because people are desperate for fame. They want to make a name for themselves. And there's they've actually found that you get a dopamine release when you see how many likes you got on a post that you make. When you make a post and you get 0 likes, you actually get depressed. When you make a post, you're like, ooh, this was reshared like 17 times. I must have found something people like. There's a similar dopamine release. Fame doesn't last. It is there for a moment and then you are forgotten. Just think about this. How many of you can describe in detail your great-great-great-grandfather? Maybe you know a story or two, but you don't know them. They had their time. They had their moments. You don't know them. This might seem depressing, but the reality is you have your moment and it doesn't last. So we see that you won't find lasting meaning and pleasure. The second thing we see shows up in verses 12 through 17, and it's that you won't find lasting meaning in wisdom. Follow along with me in verse 12. So I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who comes after the king? Only what has already been done. Then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there is more gain in light than in darkness. The wise person has eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I perceived that the same event happens to all of them. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this also is vanity. For of the wise as of the fool there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come all will have been long forgotten. How the wise dies just like the fool. So I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me, for all is vanity and a striving after wind. The second point we see here is that you won't find lasting meaning in wisdom. Now, this is a part that I find particularly fascinating, because much of what you find in Ecclesiastes, you could find parallels in Confucianism, you could find parallels in Buddhism, you could find parallels in Greek mythology and Greek philosophy. You can find parallels in there. But here's what you find in all of these other philosophies. They always put philosophy as the greatest good. They always say, well, wisdom, if you could achieve enlightenment, that is the greatest good. And yet the author has enough humility to recognize that even wisdom itself, while it is good, it is not the highest good. Wisdom is a tool that helps you do what is good, but wisdom is not the highest good. Now, he begins by clarifying that wisdom is in fact better than folly. Very practically, he says, listen, the wise person can see where he's going. The person who's stumbling around in the dark and can't see things is going to get in a lot of trouble. The fool is going to have a really rough life. Just read the book of Proverbs for more than 2 seconds. The wise man is going to make better decisions. And so wisdom is good. And he's not saying to avoid wisdom. He's not telling you to be the fool. What he is telling you is that if wisdom is your highest goal, you will be disappointed. Why? Because wise people die just like the fools. Wise people don't live forever. Wisdom does not grant you immortality. You will die someday. In fact, you'll find, one of the great comedians, George Burns, I think is a great illustration of this. George Burns was a comedian that died in the year 1996. He was 100 years old when he died. And this man pretty much had a second career as the old comedian. He had so many things he did, but I got to tell you, if you follow this man's lifestyle, you will not make it to 100. Okay? In fact, one of the things he said, he says, I smoke 10 to 15 cigars a day. At my age, I have to hold on to something. This man smoked, drank. This man did not eat healthy. He did all sorts of unhealthy things, and he lived to be 100. Okay? And people kept asking him, what's the secret? He's like, I don't know. I just do whatever I want. But the reality is, for every George Burns that lives to be 100, there are healthy, wise people that die young. It's one of the sad evils, and I don't even say moral evil. It's one of the sad evils, things that ought not to be. There are those of you in this room who destroy your body with the stuff you do, and you're going to live long. It's just true. Some of you are going to live very long with your beat-up body. Some of you are going to be super healthy and make all these decisions, and you're going to die young. That is one of the pieces that he's talking about here. Wisdom doesn't mean you're going to last forever. Is it good? Yes. Is it God? No. It is not the highest good. The third point we see shows up in verses 18 through 23. So follow along with me in verse 18. I hated all my toil which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool, yet he will be master of all for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. So I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun. Because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. What is a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toils beneath the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night his heart does not last. This also is vanity. The third point we see is that you can't find lasting meaning in legacy. Some of you are living and saying, okay, I know I'm not going to live forever, but maybe I'm going to create a legacy that will go on for generation to generation to generation, that I'm going to pass this down. And he draws out a very sad reality. That some of you are people who are going to work incredibly hard. Some of you are perfectionists. My brother is this way. He's a hardworking man. Everything is precise, planned out, and someday all of his hard labor is going to be passed down to somebody else. And they may not take the same care with it that he does. And so he pours all this time into these things. And yet, at the end of the day, somebody else may ruin it. In fact, if this was Solomon, this is what happens to him. Solomon makes Israel one of the greatest empires of his time. Israel grows to be the greatest it will ever be during Solomon's day, and yet when Solomon dies, his son Rehoboam takes over, and within 3 days the kingdom is ripped apart. 3 days it takes his son to rip apart everything that Solomon did. Think about that. Isn't that a sad thought? Some of you are spending your lives pursuing excellence in all things, only to realize that at some point you're going to have to hand it down to another person. Whether it be your children or whether it be at your job, you have built a great job. You have worked your tail off. You have built something great. And someday someone's going to take over for you, and they may not do the same work that you do. This happened to me when I was a young adult. I worked at Walmart, and I built bikes. I was a bike assembler. I was in charge of the assembly department over at Walmart. And when I got there, it was in shambles. Broken pieces of bikes were everywhere. It was not a good environment. And for 4 years, I worked my tail off, and I made that place efficient. I worked my tail. I made it. The sales of bikes went up tenfold in those 4 years that I worked there. And so I created the system, I put it in place, and then I went on to finish college, and I found out within a year everything was lost. And I thought, wow, there's 4 years of my life. What was the point? Some of you are so invested into your legacy, thinking about what's going to happen. And in fact, whoever takes over after you might ruin it. It doesn't last. And maybe the next generation will do well, but what about the person after them? Something to think about. Well, I hope I've not thoroughly depressed you by now. I assure you there's some good news in this message. We got 23 bad news verses, and we get ourselves a good 2 or 3 good news verses. But they're really good news. So pick up with me in verse 24. There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat and who can have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner, he has given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give to the one who pleases God. This also is vanity and striving after the wind. Our final and perhaps most important point of today: even in the absence of lasting meaning, God grants joy to those who seek him. Even in the absence of lasting meaning, God grants joy. You see, there's a 3-letter word that shows up here that has not been present throughout all of chapter 2. It is the word God. For the first 23 verses, the reason why this test has been meaningless, has been vapor, is because he has not seen it through the lens of God. And finally, God shows up. So notice the way he says things. He says, there is nothing better than to eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. Now, you might be thinking, didn't he just say earlier that pleasure doesn't last? Didn't he just say earlier that pleasure is vanity? It is when pleasure is your highest goal. But when you view it as a gift from God, it is bestowed with meaning and purpose. Because notice what he says. In verse 24, he says, this also I saw. Now let me stop there. Because in this book, we have seen that phrase several times already. When you see the phrase, this also I saw, the very next words are traditionally, is vanity. He normally says, this I saw is vanity. And so the fact that he goes with the same beginning, but he says, this I saw is from the hand of God. Everything changes when you view things through the lens of God. You see that job that doesn't last, when you see it as a gift, and that God gave you those moments to be productive and to do something that's meaningful to you, when you see that gift, all of a sudden, instead of trying to find your purpose in it, you can find gratitude in it. You can be grateful to God that he gave you the opportunity to do that job, and even though it was wasted after you left, the work you put in was good because God gave it to you. The pleasure that God gives you, those moments that God gives you, they are a gift, so receive it as a gift. Enjoy life. Stop striving for that next thing and start to receive what God is giving you. And in that you will have joy. That will be joy instead of despair. That the meaning that we find is from what God has done for us. This is how we get away from the vanity. Now, you might be thinking, so Pastor Johnny, are you saying then that I could just do whatever foolish and stupid thing I want because God's going to let me enjoy it? No, he says flat out, to the one who pleases God, this is a gift. To the wicked man, he gives him the wearisome task of building up their wealth just to give it to the one who pleases God someday. So if you're thinking, I'm just going to do stupid things, I'm going to do sinful things, and that's going to be my lot, no, God will remove your ability to enjoy. See, here's the deal. Our greatest moments, you may have noticed that some of the best moments in your life were not what you planned. It's when things did not go according to plan, and God opened your eyes to see that moment. Oh, that God would open our eyes to see the daily gifts he gives us, that we might have gratitude in our hearts to him, and that we may glorify his name for these things. So perhaps you're sitting here listening and you said, you know what, maybe you are a person who has been entrapped by these things, the constant striving after the wind. having it for a moment, only finding yourself longing for the next thing. Maybe you need to take a step back and say, God, open my eyes that I would see your hand at work in these things. Help me to see this as you see it. And Lord, help me to find that joy in the giver and not the gift itself. I want to finish with this thought. Notice the impact that this test has on the author without God's intervention. Look at verse 17 again. He says, "So I hated life, because all that was done under the sun was grievous to me." And in verse 18, "I hated all of my toil in which I toil under the sun." And in verse 20, he says, "So I turned about and gave up my heart to despair." When you try pursuing these things without God in mind, it leads to despair, it leads to depression, and it leads to hating life. But when you see God's hand at work, even the most mundane task can be a source of great joy. I hope and pray that this encourages you today. Let's pray.